All right, and thanks for the invitation. I feel like kind of a fraud here because I don't do anything biological. So I tried to pick something that I hope will be interesting to you. And maybe there'll be some mathematics here that you could take away for your own work. So chaos. People tend to, when I give this talk to a general audience, people might not know what that is, so I start with 5 minutes of Chaos 101. And then I'm going to give you some examples and end up with some stuff about dance, which is always kind of fun. And some of these things, by the way, and many of you are going to teach, your postdocs are going to teach, and I'll try to mention the utility of this kind of stuff for hooking undergraduates into actually getting interested in STEM stuff, okay? And there's a lot of that here. So chaos. This is not chaos in your living room or chaos in the Middle East. This is the word chaos, which was co-opted by mathematicians to describe a different kind of thing. And this different kind of behavior is behavior that is very, very sensitive to small changes, but there's some structure. And because the TSA doesn't let me carry this around, I have a movie. This is a double pendulum that I built. This is a canonical example of a chaotic system. This is not high-speed slowed down video or whatever. This is natural speed. It's 2 pieces of aluminum and 4 ball bearings. And even though the physics is really simple, you know, you could imagine writing F equals ma and mg sine theta and so on and so forth. It's a little nastier than that, but you could do that. And the equations that you would come up with don't have any random variables in them, and they're pretty simple, and yet the behavior is really, really complicated. And if you have the right kind of glasses, you can look at this and see some structure, okay? And I'm going to show you what those glasses look like and what that structure looks like in the next couple of minutes. So back to that slide now with the canonical thing that everyone in my field uses, the butterfly effect, which everyone has heard of. I'm sure butterfly flapping its wings sets off a hurricane next week in Tokyo or something like that. Small change, large effect, sensitive dependence on initial conditions. And yet there's structure, there's a hurricane. Okay, there's a hurricane, there's some sort of structure. Some other interesting and useful words up there. This one is wiggly. I'll get to that over the course of the time. Deterministic. Systems that are deterministic, they're again, no random variables. If I drop this thing, there's not a small chance that it will go up and a large chance that it will go down. It's going to go down. The current state determines the future evolution. That's a deterministic system. Dynamic system is just something that changes with time. Non-linear, that is a necessary condition for chaos. It's also the way the universe is. The best way to describe non-linearity to your non-mathematical grandmother is to talk about the gas gauge in a car, where if you drive 100 miles and the tank's full, the needle barely moves, and then you drive another 100 miles and it plummets. Non-linear. So what you want is a linear relationship between the amount of gas in the tank and the position of the needle, but many cars are like this. It's a non-linear relationship, and again, that's a necessary condition for chaos. Okay, another metaphor that we use in my field is an eddy and a stream, and an eddy has kind of a particular shape and size and structure, and you could imagine dropping 2 wood chips into it and taking kind of a time-lapse photograph from above. The 2 wood chips are separately. Drop one here and watch it do this. Drop another one slightly over, watch it do that. They would both trace out the eddy, but in a very different order. Okay, structure, sensitivity. Now, there's a graphical representation that we use in nonlinear dynamics to great advantage, and it's called the state space. And that begs the question, what are state variables? Because the state space is the space whose axes are the state variables. If I want to describe the position of my elbow, unless I'm damaged, I need one variable for position, an angle, and I need a velocity. Okay, so I need 2 numbers to describe what my elbow is doing. My wrist, what do you think? Angle, angle, and 2 angular velocities. So 4 numbers to describe this. This would be, what do you think? 6, right? The Euler angles and the velocities. So these are, so you can imagine describing the state of the human body like Avatar did in motion capture in that movie, that's an awful lot of numbers. We'll get back to that. So my pendulum, for example, has 4 state variables. It has the top joint and the bottom joint and those 2 velocities. And so you need 4 numbers to completely describe it. And you can watch the thing wiggling, or you could imagine plotting the angle of the top joint as a function of time and the angle of the bottom joint as a function of time. Or you can plot in the state space where you would be plotting the angle versus the angular velocity versus the other angle and the other angular velocity. And as the device moves from some initial condition where I started it in that video, right there maybe, it would follow some sort of curve through that space. Okay, so that's an initial condition where you started it, and there's some sort of a trajectory through state space. This representation is useful because it kind of gets rid of time, and it brings out the patterns and the relationships between the variables and the way that things go together, without all the details of time. So that's part of why that's useful. So the trajectory from that initial condition might go that way, and depending on what the system's like, if there's some friction, there might be some transient behavior as the trajectory kind of converges to a fixed point attractor. Okay, lots of words. Attractor, some subset of the state space to which some larger subset of the state space converges. And there's, the transient is kind of circularly defined as what dies out, and the attractor is what's left after the transient dies out, and we can talk about that later. Are there dynamical systems people in here? Ah, okay, so we've got some. Good. All right. There are 4, and you guys all know this, there are 4 kinds of these, 4 kinds of attractors. There are fixed point attractors. These are points in the state space that kind of vacuum up nearby trajectories. A pendulum hanging down is at such a thing. The voltage in here is at such a thing, 12 volts DC. That's a fixed point. But the voltage into which this is plugged is not a fixed DC voltage. It's not 12 volts. It's wiggling, right? It's 110 volts, 60 hertz, whatever. That's a different kind of attractor. It's called a limit cycle or a periodic orbit. And the electrical system that feeds that outlet is a dynamical system that is designed to have this kind of an orbit where this is 110 volts and it goes around every 60th of a second. Second kind of attractor. Third kind, I'm not going to talk about. 4th kind, I'm going to talk about a lot. These are what are called chaotic attractors or strange attractors. These are the things that we use the eddy as a metaphor for. It wasn't English, but you get the idea. And they have lots of interesting properties. This is fancy words for that sensitivity, the butterfly flapping its wings. If I were to start this point not here, but here, we would see the same asymptotic structure, but instead of going over here and around in a bunch and then over here, it might trace it out in a different order. Okay, this is a popular misconception. Many, perhaps most, chaotic systems have some fractal structure in the state space, but not all. So chaos is not equal to fractals. There are fractals that have nothing to do with chaos, and there are chaotic systems that have no fractal structure. So this is kind of Scientific American bug, pop science bug. This is useful from a standpoint of actually leveraging this stuff to do something useful. If I stand on a point on a chaotic attractor and I draw a ball of radius epsilon around my feet, it is the case that the trajectory from every initial condition inside the basin of attraction of this attractor will eventually enter into that epsilon ball. So the trajectories cover this thing densely in that mathematical sense. And that's useful for the purposes of control theory, as we'll talk about later. And there's lots of other interesting mathematics that goes with these, but these are the 2 main ones. So there's leverage, and yet there's kind of a gathering of the trajectories onto this structure and a denseness with which they cover that structure. And that's going to turn around and turn to advantage. Now, computer scientists in here? Okay. How I generated those pictures, all the pictures that I showed you were from a system called the Lorentz system. This was a meteorologist from MIT who was interested in studying the dynamics of a piece of fluid heated from below. You all cook, you know what happens, convection rolls. Okay? This is a really simple model of that, but it's one of the examples that, and you guys have these too. You have nematodes, right, and Arabidopsis that you all play with. We all play with that. Okay? And the computer scientists have hello world. This is our hello world and our Arabidopsis, or whatever your model organism is. Anyway, so this is a set of ordinary differential equations that say if I know the values for the state variables x, y, and z, and I know the values for these parameters a, r, and b, which we can talk about those if you want. This is a derivative that tells me all this. I know all this stuff. It tells me how the variables change. So this tells me where I am on that state space, and this tells me which way I'm going to go. That's what a differential equation is. And you guys are mathematical biologists. This is not terrifying, right? Okay, good. Hopefully I was not insulting. Anyway, the cool thing about chaos is that if the differential equations are describing a chaotic dynamics, there is no analytic closed form solution to them. You cannot. It's not just that I cannot or you cannot. One cannot. It is impossible to write down with a finite amount of writing a solution to these. So you have to solve them with a computer using things like this that you've probably heard about. MATLAB's ODE 45 does this. Okay, people use MATLAB in here, I'm sure. So ODE 45 does that. But the point of my hand waving here is that this is experimental mathematics. The computer is the lab here in this field, largely. It's why this field didn't take off until the 70s or 80s, because there weren't, i7 processors then. There's another in gray type here, there's another interesting issue, which is computers make mistakes, right? And if the computer's your lab, that's interesting. And in fact, computers, the solver can actually cause one of these to turn into one of those. And that's kind of terrifying. Kind of like if the Hubble turned nebulae into quasars or something like that. It's a bad idea. Okay, so segue to the next slide is chaos is not just a numerical phenomenon. It just doesn't just turn up in differential equations and integrations of differential equations. The universe is largely nonlinear. You biologists, you know this. And chaos is not rare. So one of my favorite examples is the brain, I've been told, is normally chaotic, but certain recreational drugs make it go periodic. And the heart is normally mostly periodic, but ventricular fibrillation is a chaotic state that kills you. Anyway, so there is this stuff around in our lives. There's a lot of it in celestial mechanics, and there's a ton of it in fluid flows. This is my colleague John Cromaldi at CU, who investigates how corals use chaotic mixing to bring the egg and the sperm together. Okay. Now, chaos is not rare, but it's not all chaos all the time. Again, our brains, sometimes they're chaotic, sometimes they're not. Those changes are called bifurcations. This is not like the word sounds like something that splits in two. A bifurcation is the attractor that the system has changed its topology, has really changed its spots. It's not just that it's moved or changed its shape. Something really fundamental has changed about the shape. Different number of holes or pieces or something like that. And I don't know what parameter it is that causes the heart to go into ventricular fibrillation, but we dynamicists would think about some knob and that knob turning and the dynamics bifurcating and the heart bifurcating, the dynamics of the heart bifurcating. So that's how we would think about it. So the system that I've been playing with so far is this same set of equations, but if I change in particular that number, I can get the system to do that or that. So you can imagine your eddy in your stream, it rains, and so the water comes down and the eddy in the stream changes shape. It might eventually just go away. So that's the analogy there. So that's my Chaos 101. And the pieces of that you need in order to understand the rest of the talk are the fact that there's this sensitive dependence on initial conditions. Small change can have a large effect. But it's not that all hell breaks loose and things just blow out to infinity. There is a pattern. There's a geometry, and there's an attractor that kind of brings the trajectories onto that structure. And on that structure, which can change if somebody turns the dynamical knobs, on the chaotic attractor, you have this dense coverage. That is a trajectory from anywhere in the basin of attraction, which is exactly what it sounds like, will relax to the attractor and eventually get to within epsilon of every point on the attractor. That is useful for a number of purposes, including engineering application called control theory. So control theory is the branch of engineering where they design thermostats and cruise controls and things that get rocket ships to Mars and so on and so forth. So here's an idea. I want to get from A to B. That's my task as an engineer, to design some sort of thing that turns the knobs of my system so that I'm starting at A and it starts turning the knobs and it gets me to B. Traditional control theory, what they do is they'll design some sort of controller that minimizes some cost functional going from A to B, and they kind of, it's like we're driving to the airport. You know, you pick that road we came in with all the Shoney's on the side and the Waffle Houses. There's this way you go, and you kind of pick this way because you want to minimize your time or your gas, or you want to stop at Shoney's, whatever. Instead, you could imagine an alternative idea. I'm here. I want to get to here. What if I just turned my knob of my dynamical system to a value that caused the system to have an attractor that got near B, and I just wait? Okay? And that worked. You can't prove how long it's going to take to get there, so you don't want to do this for a nuclear plant. Okay? And I put the masthead of this paper down here to remind myself to tell you the story about how hard this was to get published in 1989. Because engineers are trained to avoid chaos at all costs. And this was using chaos to do something. And it took years to get through the review process. Okay? So that was a second lesson here. And I'm sure, you know, you guys are doing work at the boundary of two fields. You're going to have the same effect going on. Right? Is that right, boss? No?
He's the boss.
Founder, anyway. All right. So that's using this business of denseness to let's just build an attractor that touches the place we want to get to and just wait. We can also be a little smarter. We could, actually no, this is that. So this is the same kind of thing, which is I am here, I want to get to there, so I just kind of turn the parameters until this thing that I'm living on touches the place that I want to get to, and I just wait. But it could take a long time. Well, what if we also took advantage of this sensitive dependence on initial conditions and try to figure out where we could deliver a small tap at a very well-chosen place in order to not have to wait quite so long. And these are actually, believe it or not, 2 slides from my PhD thesis that I still show 23 years later. Okay? So this was my competitors. This is what everyone does, and this is what I did. And what was interesting about this was not actually that I did better, but I was working in the AI lab at MIT, and I wrote a computer program that could design controllers for chaotic systems. And the really cool thing about this, which is I guess why they signed my thesis, was the first thing that the program did was to push the system directly opposite of the direction of where it wanted to go. So it's like me driving to Denver International Airport to fly to San Francisco. So that was kind of cool. And it's faster, which is good. Here's another great application. This is work by a guy who was a student of mine a long time ago. And you can see what he was doing, right? He was also using this idea of finding the places where a small tap, in this case, burn of the gas in the spacecraft would be leveraged by the natural dynamics. So if here I'm rolling down this way, but if I just did a little hop over this way, I'd roll that way. find those places and exploit them. That's what Eric was doing. And he was, his capstone example of his thesis was, how do you get to the moon using less gas? And some of us are old enough to remember it takes about a week to get to the moon with the standard kind of orbits. This took 2 years, but it used 38% less gas. So if you're carrying stuff and not people, this is a win. Okay. And there's been lots of other good work in this area. This is another guy, he wasn't my student, but he did this in my class and then for his thesis. If you're thinking about the state space, you can actually think about the surface that's dynamically downhill in that funny state space that's downhill from where you are. And if you can find this, the curve, the surface that's downhill from where you are, and you can find the surface that's uphill from where you want to be, and you can find an intersection, then you can get there for free. And Jeff has actually had missions flown that use this to get from parking orbit on one side of the moon to a parking orbit on the other side of the moon by choosing exactly where to jump off onto that surface and then choosing exactly where to switch to the other one for free. Okay? Yes, please ask questions. Yes, that's exactly the trade-off here is sensitive dependence is great, but if you blow it, your error blows up exponentially. And what I did here was I built a local linear controller that could kind of, imagine balancing a baseball bat in your hand. This thing would balance along the trajectory, and think about a tube along the trajectory. And my controller knew what the eigenvalues and eigenvectors were, and so it would do that control kind of, balance it as it went along. These people, these guys, call that station keeping. So there's actually another layer of control that kind of keeps you gathered onto this nice designed thing. So there's it's like this conductor adjudicator that takes care of that. Without that, it wouldn't work. Yeah, absolutely. All right. So I got interested in thinking about whether we could do this in spatiotemporal dynamics as well, and the cartoon of that is, where do we release the butterflies to steer the hurricane? Okay, this is politically incorrect, right? Because you got to steer them somewhere, right? So the task that I tangled with, and I kind of not doing a whole lot of it anymore because it turned out to be really hard, which is why that last word on the bottom. We're trying to figure out where do you, so a fluid flow is not just a system with a finite number of state variables. It's more like my shirt or your coffee. There's an infinite number of variables of a continuum system like this. So the task of modeling it is much harder, which is why PDEs and climate models and weather models take a long time. But it's also much harder to control, because where do I tap? And what do I do with it? There's an infinite number of possible ways. It's not just like my pendulum where I can go bonk like that to the lower joint. Much richer task. So how do we do that kind of figuring out how to find those sensitive points and use them in these kinds of systems is much harder. And we did some work in the lab on this and also in simulations. So we built a jet, and this is a jet kind of like a hose is a jet, is a water into air jet. A blow dryer is an air into air jet. This is an air into air jet. It's about this high, about that wide. Air goes in these holes, goes up through here. There's all sorts of stuff in here that kind of reduces the turbulent intensity of the flow and all that. And it comes out this really funny, thin, narrow, long strip. And fluid dynamics people? Okay. If you make it 2D like that, the math is way easier. If you have a hairdryer kind of jet, the math is nasty. So we did a lot of work to make the math easier. Now imagine if you were looking right down here, you'd see this sheet of air from the side. Of course, you wouldn't see it if it's air, but if you squirt atomized canola oil in it, you see it. That's how people do this kind of thing, especially because atomized mazola oil fluoresces under laser lights. So this is looking down the whole slit. This is, we've sliced it with a laser, and you can see what the jet is doing, which is exactly what happens when you blow out a candle, right? Blow out a candle, it kind of does this. And you see the, and that is one of the fundamental instabilities of a jet. In fact, there's a wonderful story going back to 1857, where there was a dinner party, and some physicist was sitting at the dinner party, and he noticed when the violins hit a certain note, the gas lamps on the wall flared up. What was going on there was sound is a longitudinal wave, and the gas lamp is a jet. And you know very well from all this wonderful movie of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, right, that if you excite something at its natural frequency, all hell breaks loose. And so the violins were setting off a longitudinal wave that was exciting the jet, the gas into air jet, such as to cause this thing to start spewing off vortices which would entrain air, which would make the jet burn bigger. And this set off a wonderful series of research on singing flames, and people were reading poetry to flames, and it really got weird. Anyway, but the point here is that this jet likes to wiggle like that. So maybe I could do something down here and either suppress that or make it wiggle more. And that's what we did. We used little microflaps, microelectromechanical systems, which are, hopefully my movie will work, little butterflies. And we stuck them right at the edge of the jet in the boundary layer of the flow, which is where the flow is ticklish, and use them to control what's going on. This is a side view. This little white thing is the flap. Here it's not flapping, and there it's flapping. So you can see it has small change, large effect. Okay, so that worked. My dream was, this is a cylinder head in a car. This is the fuel injector. There is some area right up here where the gasoline is not getting mixed in well with the air, which causes the ignition to be incomplete, and then your engine pings, and then you fail your emissions test. And my idea, my dream, is that you take these jets and you use them to make the thing spin off a vortex and fire it up there and break that up. These things don't withstand cylinder heads. So we didn't get that far. But, you know, there are lots of interesting practical applications here. Now, other than that, the Gulf Stream is a jet. This is our jet, Gulf Stream. Imagine if I took one of the Florida Keys and went like that with it. The previous picture shows me I could actually steer the Gulf Stream by doing that, which is pretty scary. Small change, large effect. So something down here is in that region where doing something with that could really change the Gulf Stream's characteristics and direction. And in view of things that you guys know a lot more about than I do, which is the deep currents in the oceans, we think of these things, these conveyor belts, as very, very robust. Okay? We hope. Now, in terms of doing any sort of research work saying I'm going to get this to do that, or how should I wiggle Key West in order to cool off England, it's not going to happen because this was an incredibly delicate experiment. We have $200,000 worth of stuff wrapped around it. Again, this was a revelation to me. This is nothing to biologists, but it was a revelation to me that we would have to do this much stuff to get our experiment to not like do something different when the light was on or not. Okay, again, you're all smiling because you know this. I didn't. So there's no way we're going to get this to work out in the real world, but I was hoping for the cylinder head. Anyway, and there's lots of other things you could do. But I wanted to make sure I got to this because people in this audience are interested in, I need a microphone, movement, and this is leading up to movement. This is work by not one of my students. This is Diana Dabby, who is, she was a student of Stephen Strogatz. Those of you who are dynamicists know that name. She's one of the really scary people in the world. She was a PhD in electrical engineering from MIT and also a Carnegie Hall level concert pianist. Okay? And this was Diana's PhD thesis, and I happened to get her paper to review. And this paper came with a cassette tape. Okay? And here's the idea that this is just fabulous. This is Diana's work, and it's just wonderful. So imagine, and this is going to go back to this structure and sensitivity and so on and so forth. Take a musical piece and think of it as a sequence of symbols. Okay? C-E-G, C-E-G for that one. And then take a chaotic attractor. Doesn't matter which one. We're not saying that the music is being modeled by the chaos. It's just a blender into which we're going to throw the musical piece. And assume that the musical piece, which for the one I've chosen, all the notes are the same length, which we can talk about that differently. And so take the point on the attractor and label it with the first pitch in the sequence, and then take however long it was till that next note, take that point on the attractor, label it with the second note. You see what she's doing here? She's taking this musical piece and she's wrapping it around the attractor. Okay? And she's spacing the dots that she associates with the successive notes exactly the right distance apart as they were in the original piece. And for, again, dynamicists, she's using the symbol sequence to induce a symbol dynamics in the chaotic attractor. It's not a generating partition, but it's still fun. Okay. Now, imagine if you then drop a wood chip right there again, and you have some sort of system, some sort of vision system that can recognize when the wood chip is near that point and play the note C. Okay? Recognize when the wood chip is near that point and play the note E, and so on and so forth. What are you going to hear if you put that wood chip in exactly perfectly, to within infinite precision, the same place in the eddy, and let it go? What do you think you'd hear? Exactly perfectly. You'd hear the same piece. But what if you put the wood chip someplace else in the eddy and watch its different path through the eddy and let that wood chip play the notes that it hits? Hopefully this works. This is the before, okay? This is the music that she was wrapping around the attractor, and that is the first 2 bars of it. Measures of it. So you take that music, you wrap it around the attractor, you drop a new wood chip, you play the notes that the wood chip hits, and you see, or you hear, okay? Chaotic musical variations, in the classic sense of a variation on a theme. Kind of. Diana sent this to a music journal and they went ballistic. Okay? You can't do that to Bach. No. You may not, okay? I think Bach, well, who knows? J.S. Bach. So of course I wrote back and I said, this is great. What would it do to Beethoven? What it would do to Gershwin? So I got another cassette tape, and we've been, she's great. She's just wonderful. And I play this every spring in the course that I teach, okay, because you want an undergraduate to actually get interested in solving an ODE, okay, or thinking about a mapping, okay. It's a really compelling thing for undergraduate education. And an undergraduate came up to class in I think 1995 or 1996 and said, I'm a ballroom dancer. Let's do this for dance. So instead of music in, music out, the idea is dance in, dance out. But pretty much the rest of it's the same, except we do the geometry a little differently. So imagine you have a 300 move dance sequence. And this is generally keyframed dance sequences. So when you get movement from animation or motion capture, it's not continuous motion, it's keyframes, right? And they're spaced by this second. So imagine if we have 300 moves of dance. We take 300 points, evenly temporally spaced on the chaotic attractor, and then we take, we do some sort of we actually use a Voronoi diagram to say, okay, this is the area of state space that's closer to that than to anything else. This is the area of state space that's closer to that than anything else. So this is basically a partition, again, not a generating partition for the symbol dynamics people here. And you can imagine the original trajectory lighting up those cells in a particular order, right? And that's the cell itinerary. And then you could imagine taking the first move and putting it in the first cell that gets lit up, the second one in the second cell, the third one in the third cell, and so on and so forth. So instead of wrapping the musical notes around the attractor, you're wrapping these symbols around the attractor, and you would get something that looked kind of like that. And then you could do the same trick. But instead of Bach, we used a slightly different before. Okay, I had to animate this. This is the extent of my abilities. Okay, it also dates the work. So here's what happens if you take that dance and you generate a chaotic variation of it. And the first time I played this at a dynamics conference, and it was Dynamics Days, and I don't know where, Lou Pecora piped up from the third row and said, looks like Al Gore doing the Macarena. So this is a success, I suppose. All right? And it doesn't matter which dynamical system you use. This is the one before was one of them. This is a different one. They all look kind of like the original, but you can tell there's something different going on. Okay? So that kind of like is actually really interesting. Now what this actually does, and here's the mechanics of that. The original dance went around here, and then it went up there someplace, and then it went around here. So that original dance got stuck onto the path, like onto a snail, onto the path of the original trajectory. But now we've generated a new trajectory that doesn't go exactly this way. Maybe it goes like that instead. So what happens is the trajectory, the variation will follow the original for a while, and then it goes over here. And what this ends up doing is taking the original piece and taking different chunks out of it and sticking them together. And you could do this with 3 random variables. Okay, I had a student do a project that showed that doing it this way was actually more aesthetically appealing. So that was interesting. But you could certainly do it that way. And you can see that if you watch this animation. This is a composite animation that has a Macarena, and then it has a ballet jump, and then it has a Kenpo karate kata. Okay? So when I show you the variation of this, when it jumps to different parts of the sequence, you're really going to see it. There's Macarena, in and out of karate, more Macarena, karate for a while. Someplace in here there's a full ballet jump. There it is. Okay? So you can really see what it's doing. If you took the same keyframes and randomly shuffled them, you get something that looks very different, looks kind of epileptic. Okay? Now, the animation software that I'm using uses spline interpolation to connect the keyframes. So you are seeing, you're not seeing it jump like that, you're actually seeing some of this. Some of that's the mathematics of smooth connection. But you can see the difference, right? Okay. Musicians and artists use this. Lucas Foss has used this kind of structure. There's a lot of it in hip-hop. In dance, one of our modern dance pioneers, Merce Cunningham, used this. He would take a dance, he would chunk it up, and he would throw the I Ching to select the order of the chunks. And the dancers and the critics and the audiences all hated it. Okay. Since then, it's become one of the kind of the aleatory choreography has become one of the keystones of modern dance. But there is an issue. Okay. And the issue is, we know that the human body can go from here to here to here to here because we saw it happen. And we know that the human body can go from here to here to here to here because we saw it happen. But going from here to here might hurt. Okay, these can be very far away in body space. And if you have to go from here to here to here in 1/10 of a second, and there to there in 1/10 of a second, those could be very different in body space. So those places where the chunks get patched together can give you problems. Kinesiological problems and stylistic problems. Because breakdancing, you move very differently than ballet. So what do we do here? Well, this one you'll see this. So here's, this is not me doing the animation. This is someone else. Beautiful ballet adagio. And if we do a chaotic variation on that, you will see those places where the abrupt transitions happen very clearly. Ouch, ouch. There, see, you see, they can see they're really, yeah. And we're attuned to this kind of stuff, even more so than we're attuned to music because, well, especially in the Prelude in C major, Bach is playing with key, and so when he moves to a different part of the piece, you hear a key shift. Here it's more striking cognitively. I've had a bunch of wonderful students working on this over the years, and one of them decided, well, what would this do to text? And he chose Alice in Wonderland, which I don't think was a fair example. The second thing he chose, I'm in the South, maybe I shouldn't say this, but he did the first George Bush's second inauguration speech and did a chaotic variation of it, and it was indistinguishable. Actually, no, I think it was W, anyway. Again, I hope it's, did they shoot people for saying things like that down here? Okay, good. Anyway, all right, back to movement. What do we do about this if we actually want to generate like a dance for people to perform? Well, there's a name for that. It's called interpolation. Connect the dots in some way. Again, fabulous teaching opportunity for undergraduates. If you think about keyframed animations and talk about to kids, how do you connect that? You know, how do you do this? Well, shortest path, yes, okay? And then you have to think about, you can actually get them to think about derivatives because you want the derivative to be continuous, okay? Otherwise, you do get popping. You get Michael Jackson. If the discontinuous derivatives, so if you do piecewise linear interpolation on keyframes, you get b-boy dancing, okay? You don't get the kind of this stuff, but you get the, you can imagine, right, okay? Very compelling to bring this stuff out visually in front of students. So we wanted to get this to work, not just, again, we didn't just want to get the kinesiology right. We wanted to get the fact that, you know, in ballet there's a very different aesthetic of movement than, you know, other genres. So we thought about trying to do that with pure mathematics and gave up. And we ended up instead using machine learning. If you can't do ODEs, statistics is kind of, you know, where you retreat to. And we took a corpus-based approach. That is, we had a whole bunch of examples of dance of a particular kind. Of course, you guys, professors, know this. Your students then take your 30 ballets and they put in a baseball swing when you're not looking to see what happens. So the hacks are fun. I'll show you some outtakes. So you take a bunch of movement of dance, and then you build a graph, a directed graph, where each vertex is maybe from here to here is one vertex in this graph. From here to here is one vertex. And from here to here is another vertex. So you take the movement of a joint and build a graph that says 80% of the time when I saw the elbow here, I saw it there next. And so but sometimes I saw it there next because it was moving faster, and sometimes I saw it there next. And so you build one of these graphs with probabilities for every joint in the body from your corpus. So you're sucking the patterns out of that. And then you get another really nice basic computer science course example of graph search, and actually biologists do graph search too. A lot of it, don't you? Molecular biologists do. All right, no one's nodding because they don't want to. Okay, so imagine if I want to figure out a path from this position to that position. Well, I look in the graph that I built that captures the patterns of the movement of the right shoulder, and I look for the vertex that corresponds to where I see the right shoulder is in the starting position. And then I look for the vertex that corresponds to where the shoulder is in the ending state that I want to get to. And, you know, you guys are already seeing what we do, right? So you do graph search. Shortest path, Dijkstra's algorithm, CS 101 or 201 or something like that. But there's a problem. Imagine if the shortest path in the elbow graph and the shortest path in the left hip graph are very different lengths. Or actually taken to extreme. Imagine if all of the joints can get to from starting position to ending position, except this joint had a much longer shortest path. So you're going to get there, and then this is going to take a while to come in, right? So then it becomes a much more interesting computer science problem. It's an NP-hard super exponential surf because it's the longest shortest path search, and you need to, and this is going to come back, you can't just take the shortest path through the graph for every joint because everybody has to start and end at the same time. And so that might mean that some of the joints you got to pad the motion. They got to kind of hang out and do stuff. So you'll see that in some of my examples. And of course, the real graphs are much nastier, which makes things harder. Anyway, so a couple of examples here. We fed it a ballet corpus, and we asked it to come up with a path in movement space and animation space between that position and that position. And here's what it found. Okay? Started at the right place, ended at the right place, looked balletic. There, I found out that there are things called certified movement analysts. We showed that to one of them. She said, yep, looks balletic. So there's ways to do this. Here's an outtake. Get me from here to there. Not much. There to there. Watch what it did. All looks very balletic. There we go. There was one movement of the right shoulder that was way up here in the graph, and it had the program had to pad all the other joints doing sensible stuff while it used that movement. And then there's the issue of, thing that I haven't showed you yet, is that what my elbow can do depends on what my shoulder position is, right? So there's what we actually had as a dynamic Bayesian network that captured that kind of stuff. So it's a little more complicated than what I showed you. If you take that out and you do ballet movements, but you don't insist that this guy pay attention to where this guy is, as he's allowed to do anything no matter where this one is, you get something interesting. So here's the test. Get me from here to there, using a ballet corpus, but not enforcing kind of ligaments, right? So you take ligaments out of ballet, you get Irish step dancing. So the outtakes are actually pretty fun. Now, what does that have to do with reality? The first example that I showed you with the flow control is pretty obvious that has some good applications. It's pretty obvious this one does too. You know, making the bad guy always acts kind of the same way in this video game, but he's unpredictable. Perfect way to do that. Flight simulators. I got a ride in a Boeing 777 simulator for this work. I did not do that, but you could imagine that the Army would be interested in having bad guys that act like a particular class of bad guys. Okay? And I spent a sabbatical taking this kind of to the dance extreme and putting together a performance piece out of this that involved doing motion capture on my colleague David Capps, and then from that harvested motion generating variations, and then putting together a piece that had 3 enormous screens with avatars doing different pieces of the dance and David dancing in the middle. So that was pretty fun. Something that I wanted to throw out to you guys, people keep asking me this, and I don't know if it would be useful, but you care a lot about sequences that have patterns in them, and they have kind of characteristic patterns. What about doing this and I don't know what the right experiment is, to take a strand of DNA and take the ACG to whatever, and then do this on it and then grow the organism? Is this possible? Anyway, everyone's wincing. So people always ask me this, so I thought I'm talking to mathematical biologists, what the heck? So I don't know. So that might be something that we could talk about. All right, I'm going to wrap up. So the guy who came up to me and set off the dance project is actually now a computational biologist in David Haussler's group at UC Santa Cruz, just got tenure. He was an undergraduate when he did that. He's now, full associate professor. This is Jessica, who does motion capture. This is David, who does dance. And then my postdoc, who did the flow control stuff, is also now tenured at MIT, and lots of other good folks. And I do lots of other weird stuff that I'm not going to talk about because it's almost 4:30 and I wanted to leave room for questions. So thanks for your attention.